Welcome to another episode of the Virtual New Haven Railroad. Once again, we'll be going back in time to not only see this railroad at its height, but also to get a sense of how New England as a whole felt around this time in history, which was just post-war when industry was still booming, but population was not. This route was created by Bob Jones and Michael Stephan, and is an add-on for Train Simulator by Dovetail Games. It's December 24th, 1947, here in the game, 6 o'clock at night, and we have a healthy Christmas Eve snowfall. We'll be taking an R-Class 482 all the way to New Haven tonight with a 50-car freight. It's going to be a long trip of around 60 miles, so let's climb aboard and get started. Tonight, I'll be keeping it a little bit lighter with the commentary. I'll mostly be reporting our position along the route as we go, so you can keep up at home if you'd like. With a few spots of interest here or there, but I've covered this part of the route in detail with my first guided tour video, and I plan on doing a very detailed section from Hartford to New Haven very soon in the future, so I'm going to leave the very, very in-depth stuff to that, and tonight is going to be just a little bit lighter. Here we are up in the cab of our R-Class. We'll start by opening the windows. It's freezing out tonight, but the nice thing is, sitting right behind an enormous fire and a boiler should keep things pretty comfortable. As our headlight comes on, we can also see that this locomotive comes with class lights, which are the two signal lights up at the top of the boiler. They come in 3 colors, each with its own meaning. White indicates that it's an extra train, which is not on the timetable. Green indicates that it's part of a scheduled service, but it's split into sections. And red means that the engine is at the rear of a train. Since it's Christmas Eve and I'm feeling festive, we're going to choose green tonight. Backing into the siding in front of us is a J-Class 282 Mikado. These were used by the New Haven for light freight and yard switching duties. This J-Class has just assembled our train for us and is clearing out for us to get underway. We can see that locomotive number is 3018. The New Haven Railroad numbered their J-classes between 3000 and 3024. Today, the Valley Railroad in Essex, Connecticut uses several J-classes to pull their excursion trains. Our first order of business tonight to get this locomotive rolling is going to be to top off our coal. The tender can hold up to 18 tons, and you can see that we're currently only at 7,800, so it's only about a third, less than a third. So let's get the coal ramp down and we'll start taking on some fuel. Now luckily we're at 100% water. The boiler is full and the tender is full, so we don't need to worry about that. We're topped up on coal, so now we're cleared to proceed south through the yards to get down to our train. Blower is fully on, dampers are fully open, and I'm going to release the train brake. And then I'm going to set my reverser to full forward. And independent brake is fully off. Cylinder cocks open to make sure that we don't get compressed water in those cylinders. We are ready to go. Bell is on, 2 toots on the horn. I am going to start the automatic stoker and begin piling some coal into our firebox to get the fire going and get our pressure up before we leave. The maximum amount of coal that I can shove into the firebox is 1,300 pounds, but we don't really want it to be up there. Anytime you add coal, that's actually going to dampen your fire down, reducing your steam pressure. A thick fire slows up combustion by restricting the flow of air through the grates. We always want to carry as light a fire as possible to maintain the proper boiler pressure, depending on how hard the locomotive is going to be worked. So too much coal can be a bad thing. We can actually lose pressure that way, but not enough coal will also cause a pressure drop. If the fire is too thin, the draft is likely to tear holes in it, and then the steam pressure will fall. For us here in the game, our most efficient amount of coal in the firebox is going to be around 75% of our total capacity. So we'll be looking for a target fire mass of around 975 pounds as we're going. Now I'm going to front load it now, close to 1,300 pounds, and then we're going to let that burn off as we go through the yards and head down to the head of the train. We're on the through main lines at the moment, so this is a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. The milepost markers all along the Springfield branch are these short concrete posts with the numbers painted on them. We're just passing milepost 61. Distance along the Springfield branch is measured to the passenger terminal in New Haven, which would be the 0 marker. Since the freight yards at Cedar Hill are about 3 miles north of the New Haven station, we'll actually be going only about 58 miles tonight. The Hartford yards are at the 38-mile marker, so that's going to be 23 miles to the Meadows yard once we get hooked up. Today's locomotive is the USRA 482 Mountain by Dick Cohen of Brick Kits. USRA stands for the United States Railroad Administration. That was the name of the nationalized railroad system when the federal government took over the railroads around World War I. 482s on the New Haven were known as the R class, and the railroad operated 70 of these locomotives, split into 3 groups. R1s were built between 1919 and 1924. 49 of these locomotives were built by Alco at their Schenectady and Richmond plants. R2s were an improved high-pressure boiler locomotive with more horsepower, and these 8 locomotives were built in Schenectady in 1926. The R3 was a 3-cylinder locomotive, and 13 were built between 1926 and 1928. 3-cylinder locomotives were notorious for their issues with maintenance because the 3rd cylinder was mounted between the wheels. Most railroads ended up converting their 3-cylinder locos back to 2 cylinders for this very reason, but the New Haven became perpetually broke during the 20th century and never converted their R3s. This made them some of the country's only 3-cylinder locomotives to remain 3 cylinders for their entire working lives. The USRA 482s were originally designed for passenger service, but their high horsepower also made them ideal for fast freight service, and most were used in a dual capacity. The USRA issued 10 482s to the New Haven in 1919, and the railroad found that they fit their fast freight requirements ideally, so they ordered 30 more in 1920. Our locomotive today is numbered 3547. Now, this was never a real R-Class engine. I actually made a mistake when I was setting up the scenario, so that's my bad. 3547 was supposed to be 3507, which would have made this locomotive an R2A, built by Alco in 1926 at their Schenectady plant. This locomotive had a boiler pressure of 265 psi, though in the game we'll only see a max of 240. R2As had a tractive effort of 61,200 pounds, and could reach a max speed of 72 miles an hour using their 69-inch main driving wheels. It used Baker-type valve gears. Its coal capacity was 18 tons, with a water capacity of 16,000 gallons. Total weight of the locomotive was 651,700 pounds. R2s ran in freight service on the New Haven until their retirement in 1951. And there's our caboose. We're coming up on our consist. Bell on for safety in case we've got some crew members walking in and around the cars. We're in the south end of the yards now, past the Basketball Hall of Fame, right around where the Belize car dealerships are. Now, I said before that the top speed on this locomotive is 72 miles an hour. We're not going to be seeing anything close to that tonight. Between the slick rails, we've got this bad weather is going to make our traction lower, and with our consist, we've got 50 cars plus a caboose, so 51 cars total. We're going to be pulling 5.4 million pounds, or 2,700 tons. So we're looking at an average of around 35 miles an hour tonight along the whole route. Maybe 40 miles an hour in some parts where I can get a nice long stretch, maybe slightly downhill to get up to speed. But we're definitely going to be a slow, ponderous freight. And this would have been considered a large freight for the New Haven Railroad, especially on the Springfield branch, where there was a lot less room in the yards and even between the yards. I mean, Connecticut's not really that big. I know it pales in comparison to, say, some of the western United States railroads, Union Pacific pulling mile-long freight trains or longer. The New Haven Railroad, their primary focus was passenger service, and really freight was secondary, and a lot of it was short-haul freight. So I think what they probably did was to run more trains instead of longer trains. Coming up on the South End Bridge now, that's Route 5 crossing the Connecticut River, which connects Springfield with Agawam on the far side. We could just see the platforms of the South Springfield station coming into view. Just a little toot on the whistle. Let people know that we're coming. The blower's on because I'm getting ready to close the throttle. There we go. Throttle is closed. I'm using the locomotive independent brake to stop us. As we've cleared the points of the switch, I'm going to come to a stop. Then we'll back up and connect to the head of the train. Three whistles for reversing. We've switched our headlight and turned those signal lights on red on the front of the locomotive to indicate that we're technically at the rear of a train. The train just being the locomotive at the moment. And I'm keeping the regulator and reverser nice and gentle, just around 20%. In fact, we'll knock that reverser off a little bit because we want to be less than 5 miles an hour for connecting up with the cars. Preferably even slower than that, but 5 miles an hour is really the safe max. I mean, if you hit them faster than that, like, you really wail into them and they start to tip, and you could potentially either break a coupler or straight up cause a derailment. And as we're backing up, here comes a southbound passenger departing from Springfield Union Station, being led by a 462. Those were called the I-Class on the New Haven. I-Class was one of the high-speed, or one of the primary high-speed passenger locomotives. And here we are creeping up on our own train, less than 3 miles an hour. And we just ease in for the hookup. Not too bad. I'm going to apply full brakes, and we'll pressurize the entire brake system of the train, and then the crew will, walk the train and make sure there's no air leaks and the brakes are operating properly. And those are our brake gauges. So we'll reset our headlight to the front and our indicator lights to green. This is the NE5 caboose that was included with the New Haven to New York route. The cool thing about this guy is that it includes a fully detailed interior with several camera views that you can switch between. I love sitting in caboose cupolas, and I would love to ride in one on an actual moving train. That would be awesome. So obviously this is long before the time of line-side defect detectors, end-of-train devices, and all the other modern safety equipment that trains use nowadays to detect issues At the time, it was the caboose that was used to look out for load shifting, damage to equipment or cargo, and overheating axles. It would actually be crew members' jobs to sit in the cupola facing forward and to monitor the train for any sort of issues going on. Cabooses were also used to house repair parts and maintenance equipment if something broke on the train. The caboose also served as the office for the conductor, and they often had sleeping accommodations and cooking facilities. It was actually a requirement that every freight train ran a caboose on the end, and this lasted until the 1980s when the safety laws requiring the presence of cabooses and full crews in them were finally relaxed. And now they've been replaced with computer-run detecting and reporting equipment. Alright, brake test is good to go. The time is 6:17. We have a green signal. We are cleared to highball south out of Springfiled yards. Our fire is stoked. The locomotive is ready. Independent brake is off. Train brake is fully released. Set the reverser to full forward. You can hear that I've got the live steam injectors running. Putting some additional water into the boiler before we go. Fire mass is up at 1,200, or just under 1,200 pounds. Again, I'm going to start a little high and then let that burn off as we get our speed up down the line. And brake cylinder pressure is, there we go, we've reached 0. Cylinder cocks open, bell on, and we're underway. I've got the sanders on for a little more traction. This is slow going. Like I said, 2,700 tons behind us. Stretching into the distance. We've come up a few miles an hour, so I've brought the reverser back down to 75%, and then we're inching that regulator up. Slowly getting more and more steam into the steam chest. And as the speed comes up, I'll bring the reverser back and eventually bring the throttle up even more. But this right here, 50% throttle, 75% reverser, this is a good setting for our initial acceleration, so we'll leave it here for just a bit. Locomotive starting to work fairly hard. You can see sparks coming out of the smokestack there. Across the river is Agawam. You can see a few little houses on the hill across the way. "10 miles an hour as we're coming onto the penultimate siding before we hit the mains up ahead. And that's good. We can 10 miles an hour, we can turn the bell off. We're also south of the yards. We're outside the yard limit, basically. Still at full boiler pressure of 240 pounds. No issues there. We're on the southbound main now. So we're coming up on 14 miles an hour. We're still in a 15 mile an hour zone because the last car of the train is going to be on that 15 mile an hour siding for some time. So as we come up to speed, I mean, here's the view from the caboose. We're still in the south end of the yards. We haven't even crossed underneath the Route 5 bridge yet. Meanwhile, the nose of the train is coming around the corner onto the straightaway to go down through the wildlife refuge, which at this time was still just farms and little communities. End of the train just passing by the South Springfield station now. And under the signals. Holding steady, 15 miles an hour as we go through these curves. You can see that we're just about to cross into the 60-mile-an-hour zone with the front of the train, while the rear end of the train is still at 15 miles an hour. With the caboose clear of that first siding, we're clear to go up to 20 miles an hour now. I'm going to start inching the throttle forward and then pulling the regulator back just a bit more. We also need to adjust our water flow and start getting more water into the boiler as we're down to 65%. And also need to make sure that we're adjusting our fire mass appropriately now that our regulator is coming open. We're up to 75% in the throttle. We always want to be a step ahead on a locomotive. It's a lot like flying. You need to be prepared for what you know will be coming so that you can make adjustments before they happen. So regulating coal flow, water flow, you need to be a step ahead. What is the locomotive going to be doing next, as opposed to what the locomotive is doing right now? And here we are creeping up on the field road crossing. This was a dirt road. No longer there. You can see that on the right there, several fields. The road connected those fields, and then to the left wound its way back through a residential neighborhood and eventually reaching Route 5, which is paralleling us over on the left. We're going to start some more water flow. We can see the signals and the grade crossing for the Longmeadow station. That's going to be Emerson Road. Passing the concrete whistle marker. Over to our right, that's where Emerson Road leads to a small residential neighborhood and more farms. Now at this time, this area would have been very heavily farmed still. The land would not be donated to the town until the 50s to become the wildlife refuge, the Fanny Stebbins Wildlife Refuge that it is now. Throttle's up to 90% now, with that reverser at 50, and we're coming up to 25 miles an hour as we're crossing Emerson Road past the Longmeadow station. I mentioned in the first guided tour video that this station was actually discontinued in the very early 1900s, but the building still exists. It was moved to the other side of the road and is now part of the Department of Public Works building right next to the large recycling center. So now we're almost fully wide open, heading south on this very long and straight part down into the Connecticut state line. I'm still getting a little bit of wheel slip though, so gotta be careful. You really have to finesse the controls in a state like this. The snow is making the tracks very slick, and so either too much reverser or too much power on the throttle is going to slip those wheels, and I'm trying to avoid that. And I'm letting the fire mass come down to just over 1,000 pounds now. So like I said, our target is 975, so we're actually right in that region. Blowing the whistle for the Burney Road crossing now, just before this next signal block. Again, more farming roads, dirt roads that just lead off into these, all these farms along the floodplains here of the Connecticut River. This area suffered massive flooding on at least 3 occasions when hurricanes came through in the 30s and 50s. I'm fully opening the regulator. Reverser still at 40% for the moment. And we've hit 35 miles an hour, 100% throttle. This is the Bark Hall Road crossing. This is where I used to go hiking most every day for a while, and we get a fun little view from inside of a car waiting at the line, watching as the train rolls by. Over the little bridge. I fell through the ice there once while hiking in wintertime. That was not fun. Now we're coming up on Meadow Road. As we're hitting 38 miles an hour, I've set the regulator for 100% and the reverser at 35%, which means that we are at max settings for this locomotive. Full throttle and 35% would get us up to our maximum speed. We would reach 72 miles an hour if we were not pulling any cars. And there's the caboose just crossing Bark Hall Road. That vehicle's still waiting there. Alright, we're continuing south now. We've crossed over the state line into Connecticut. We're now in Thompsonville. The next big thing we're going to see is going to be the Bigelow factory and the Thompsonville station on South River Street. And we are just shy of 40 miles an hour as we're really getting a nice run up along this long straight section into Thompsonville. Over the Raspberry Brook. And we're going to be coming up on a speed restriction through the Thompsonville station. So I'm applying brakes to lower our speed. I'm not going to quite close the throttle all the way, so I'm not turning the blower on just yet. Blower's still off, but throttle's cracked open, and obviously our reverser is still forward as we need to drop down to about 30 miles an hour. And we're at 32, and we're coming down. So I'm releasing the brakes. There we're officially under the speed limit now. We're good to go. And then I'm going to retrim the locomotive to proceed through the area at 30 miles an hour. So 30% regulator. Reverser's around 20 for the moment. Then I can adjust that up or down as necessary. And there's the Bigelow Mills. Bell on for safety as we're rolling through the Thompsonville station. And crossing over Main Street in Thompsonville, this led to the Suffield and Thompsonville Bridge over to our right, which was an iron truss bridge with stone pilings built in 1889. That bridge remained open until 1966, when the modern Route 190 bridge was opened a little bit further south. The iron of the bridge was removed, but the stone pilings still remain in the river. Here's the view from the bottom of South Street. Once again, as we're looking up into the neighborhood that I grew up in. Prospect Street just to my left, with Spring Street up beyond that paralleling. And that is where I grew up. Here's the Enfield Lumber spur. We can see some lumber cars waiting to be unloaded, still sitting in the yard there. Now this is kind of nice. I use this opportunity of the 30-mile-an-hour zone to keep pumping water into the boiler, since at full throttle, it's really, really hard to keep the boiler full. Again, it's all about planning ahead what you know that you're going to need in the next step. So if you have a really long stretch of open throttle operations coming up, you got to make sure that your water level is high, and at least the coal will be able to keep up, but the water has a little bit more issues. It's tough because what you want to use is the exhaust steam injector, because that's the one that uses the exhaust steam from the cylinders to then drive the water into the boiler, so that way you don't have pressure losses. But unfortunately, the exhaust steam injectors don't quite keep up with the water level when you have the throttle wide open, so then you have to decide when you're going to use your live steam injector, which then is going to cost you boiler pressure. So if you're up at top speed, you got to balance, what you want to use that pressure for, filling the boiler or keeping the speed up. And we're back in a 60-mile-an-hour zone, so regulator's coming up, and we'll set the reverser at 40% for acceleration. We'll bump it up to 50. Oh, but see that? I'm getting wheel slip at 50%. And then we got to back it off until the wheels stop slipping, and then maybe you can ease it back up, but we'll just leave it here at 46%. Here's the field at the bottom of Enfield High School, which is not built at this time, and then up ahead we can see the gates dropping for the Bridge Lane crossing. Fast enough, above 35 miles an hour, that I'm going to open the throttle completely and reset the reverser for 35%, which again is essentially our max cruise setting. That's going to accelerate the locomotive up to its top speed, given the conditions, without losing boiler pressure up at the top end. Passing where the water treatment plant will be many years in the future. And we're about to cross over Beeman's Brook, a small brook leading out to the Connecticut River. Just beyond that is the Parsons Road crossing. You can see Parsons Road down there to the right. It also crosses the brook. And then it crosses the tracks here at an angle. And that leads up into some neighborhoods and also eventually hooks back up with Route 5 towards the south end of Enfield. Oh, and here comes a northbound train on the other tracks. We're going to pass them. And it's an RS3 pulling a small passenger train heading up to Springfield. Blower is on and I'm shutting the throttle as we've got a 30-mile-an-hour zone coming up as we go around the corner into Warehouse Point and then across the Warehouse Point Bridge. Touch of the train brakes just to slow us down, because we're coming up on that zone very quickly. We want to be down to 30 before we hit the turn. The passenger cars and the RS3 sporting the McGuinness paint scheme, which of course would not have been accurate for 1947, which is where I claimed we were. That would not come into effect until McGuinness took over as president of the railroad and then rebranded it with the new McGuinness paint scheme. Of course, then he also proceeded to run the railroad completely into the ground and then left after 2 years to go become the president of the Boston and Maine instead. There's the small freight depot in Warehouse Point, which is a neighborhood in East Windsor. No yards there now, although the small freight depot building is still there. And coming up on the Warehouse Point Railroad Bridge now. The original span was built in 1843 when the railroad was first built and was made of wood. In 1865 and 66, just after the Civil War, an English contractor was hired to build an iron span across the same spot. This current steel bridge was built in 1903 and 04 when it was double-tracked. Crossing over the canal now, which heads down through Windsor Locks. And through this 4-track section, through the turn. We've got two passing sidings on either side of the mains here, one northbound, one southbound. We'll also be coming up on the junction for the Suffield branch, which is a single-track line that heads up to the north and northwest to go to both Suffield, which is a agricultural town, and also up to the airport in Windsor Locks, Bradley Airport. And there's the branch right there, off to our right. You just kind of look up the tracks and see it heading up to the north there, disappearing around the curve. Windsor Locks Canal is off to our left, down there in that little gully. You can just barely see it. Here's a view from the other side of the canal on the old towpath. This is now a pedestrian and biking path that goes between Suffield and Windsor Locks. Just ahead of us here, we can see the small Windsor Locks freight yard that used to be there, and then off in the distance, there's the steeple of St. Mary's Church on Spring Street, which is kind of in the downtown of what Windsor Locks would have been at this time. There's the tinsel factory over to our left. The freight yard, here's the freight depot for Windsor Locks. Coming up alongside Bain Street here. And the Windsor Locks station, which again has now been refurbished and is going to be the new station stop in Windsor for the new high-speed rail line. Coming up on the Route 140 crossing. Route 140 crosses here, goes across the Connecticut River, and then connects up with East Windsor on the far bank of the river. We can see that truss bridge there. Here's the Dexter Corporation on our left, the paper company. And you can see we're at 29.5 miles an hour and I'm still getting wheel slip. I think the snow is actually getting worse because we're having some traction issues here. And it's not like we're going uphill or anything. I mean, this is still relatively flat, but I think the snow is making the rails really, really slick on me. There's Dexter disappearing behind us in the background. You can actually see the length of our train around this curve, stretching into the distance. I always think that's pretty. Oh, there's mile marker 48. As we're coming up on the next speed zone, we're passing where the modern train station was for Windsor Locks. I guess no longer, since they have now moved it back to where the old building used to be. And there's our caboose just crossing in front of Dexter's. Up ahead is South Main Street, which is Route 159, which heads south to Windsor from Windsor Locks, following the river over to our left. At the time, before the highways, this would have been one of the primary roads to get to head south out of Windsor Locks. 50-mile-an-hour zone as we're coming up on the Waterworks Brook. But you can see the regulator's only at 75%. Reverser at 21, and I'm still getting wheel slip. So we're really limited on our power right now. Now this is a unnamed road crossing. This is a dirt road that came from Route 159, and that marks almost exactly the town line of Windsor. So we've now entered Windsor. The road crossed the tracks and led to that small square building on the edge of the marshland, and that existed on maps up to 1984. There's no crossing there anymore. The road is instead the location of PJL electrical contractors. Out to the left where those buildings are is Palisado Avenue in Windsor, which is still Route 159 heading south. To our right is extensive marshland. In modern times, it's actually full of residential neighborhoods, but here in 1947, it's still just wilderness. We're going to see that that's the case a lot, as long as the tracks stay near the river. A lot of this land was all marshland and floodplains. The river would overflow every year during heavy rains or during the spring thaw season, and now these areas just have residential neighborhoods built on top of the old wetlands, making it all flood-prone areas. Passing the whistle marker now for the Clapp Road crossing. There's no longer a crossing there now. Clapp Road is actually split into two pieces, and they don't connect or cross the tracks anymore. And up ahead there we can see the Hayden Station Road station and crossing. This was originally a stop in 1844, but seems to be gone after the turn of the century. There's no building marked there as of 1946, and we've got a fast northbound freight heading up to Springfiled with some GP9s attached to the front. And Hayden Station Road. Here we see the GP9s heading south over the 140 crossing and through Windsor Locks heading towards the bridge. You can see we're only doing 31 miles an hour, and I've got the throttle open 3/4 to full, and we're still getting wheel slip. The train's getting slower and slower, and I can't get traction to get us up to speed. So that's the thing I'm playing very carefully with. We're coming up here on the Mactown Road crossing. You can see I've poured a lot of coal into the firebox and gotten the fire mass back up to over 1,200 pounds, just in an attempt to make the locomotive more heavy and maybe get more traction on the wheels, but it doesn't seem to be affecting it all that much. And here at the signal is milepost 45. That means we're 13 miles to Hartford at this point. To our right is more expansive marsh and floodplains, which are now full of residential neighborhoods. In the 40s it was still wilderness, and actually remained so until the 50s, or maybe even 60s. But here in 1947, it definitely feels like we're just out in the middle of nowhere. You can see we're down to 30 miles an hour. I'm still getting some wheel slippage, just trying to inch the reverser forward. Getting up to just even 25% is making the wheels slip. I have to back it off to 23, 22%. Coming up here on the Kennedy Road overpass. So out to the left there we can see all the houses along the sides of Route 159, still heading south. In between the road and the tracks, here in this empty space, today is actually a small commercial zone with warehouses. Next up, we're coming up on the Pearson Lane crossing, and we can just start to see the large tobacco sheds, which are used to hang and dry out Connecticut shade tobacco. You can also see we're coming into a 30-mile-an-hour zone, which we happen to be right at 30 anyways because of all the wheel slippage. So we're right on speed here as we cross over Pearson Lane. Just beyond that are the signals. Just beyond those is the Farmington River Bridge. It's a large stone bridge in the town of Windsor. This crosses over the Farmington River and Pleasant Street. If we look out to the left, there's Pleasant Street leading up to a place called Bart's Drive-In at the intersection with Route 159. Next up, we can see the abutments coming up. This is the place where the tracks cross over Route 159. This was the site in 1975 of a pretty big train crash. As a freight was crossing the bridge, just like we're doing, a lumber load shifted and then fell over and hit the abutment. This caused a coupler to break, and it derailed the whole line of cars behind it, crashing into a huge pile off in the woods here to our right and to our left. Here we are rolling up on Windsor Station. Center of Windsor is to our right, and we've got a small freight yard to the left as we cross over Center Street. There's the Windsor Freight House, which is now an art gallery. All these yards are gone, but the freight and passenger station remain. That's Grace Church off to the right. Just beyond the church here is Batchelder Road. This connects the center of town to the right with the Loomis Institute off to our left, which today is now called the Loomis Chafee School. That's the grade 9 through 12 preparatory school that was started by the 5 Loomis brothers and their sister, because all of their children died, and they wanted to do something to give back to the community, so they started the school. And there we can see it through the leafless trees off in the distance. This here is the Island Road crossing, with the Windsor siding paralleling off to the right. Island Road also heads up to the school grounds there. You can see it looks like the sky is lightening, and maybe the snow is starting to slow down a little bit. Which will be nice. Maybe we can get some traction back and get a little bit of speed up. No, it's still slippery right now, though. I can't get anything more out of the throttle at the moment. We can see the fog is lifted. We can actually see the clouds a little bit up in the distance with maybe some stars poking through. Starting to dry up a little bit. We're up to 31.5 miles an hour now, which is nice after struggling to get any extra speed. We've gone up almost 2 miles an hour in just a few moments. I've got the regulator back wide open and the reverser at 30. And this that we're coming up on now, this is the Portman crossing, or the Portman Street crossing. This is the very south end of Windsor. We're paralleling Sinclair Street to our right. Portman once continued to cross the tracks as a dirt road and then led to that single farmhouse that was over on our left. We can see that area to our right. That's the one of the last neighborhoods in Windsor. And here's the view looking out the back of one of the houses. We can see that single farmhouse on the other side of the tracks. That whole area on the far side of the tracks is now the Windsor Meadows State Park. Passing milepost 41, and we're coming back up on the Connecticut River on our left. Coming up on our right here is the Standard Screw Company, now called Stanadyne. This is their main factory, which was built in, sometime around 1952. 1952 is the first time it appears on maps. And they make fasteners and also fuel injection pumps, as well as faucets. Now, right after their switch coming up here, but before the crossing, we would be going under Route 291 after it crosses the Connecticut River over the Bissell Bridge. 291 won't be built until 1962, but it would be right here after this switch. We'd be under it. Then we're hitting the East Barber Street crossing, which at this time is still a dirt road, crossing the tracks from the neighborhood on our right to reach two farmhouses on our left, which were next to the river. And over to our right, we see Wilson, which is the most southern neighborhood of Windsor. The main street running through it is Route 159, which was called Route 5A at the time, and this was the primary road to head north-south along the river in Connecticut. Now we're immediately upon the Wilson Avenue crossing and Wilson Station. Wilson Avenue connects out to our right with Route 159. The station was an original 1844 building from when the railroad was first built, and was demolished sometime after 1906, which is the last time it appears on maps. Next up is going to be the Meadow Road crossing, and immediately after crossing that is the Hartford city line, right around where those speed signs are. Beyond that, we can see that overpass with vehicles going over it. That is the North Meadows Expressway overpass. This was built between 1948 and 1952. This is one of the early segments of Route 91 to be constructed, and at the time was labeled Route 5A. The North Meadows Expressway began over to our right where it intersected Route 159 and then ran south a few miles into downtown Hartford where it ended right at the foot of the Bulkley Bridge. This route bypassed Main Street in the busy north end of Hartford as well as the entire railyard. It was routed through the empty marshlands near the river and past the Hartford landfill, which had just opened in 1940. The expressway experimented with early on-ramp and off-ramp designs. This stretch is now part of the Route 91 highway, leading into the downtown interchange with 84. And just rolling by on our right is the headquarters and factory for the Fuller Brush Company, famed for their door-to-door sales, women known as Fullerettes. Fuller Brush sold brushes for cleaning, as well as hairbrushes, each with a lifetime guarantee, and after World War II, they added cosmetics to their line. The building was built in 1922. Fuller Brush left the building in 1973, after being bought by Sara Lee Corporation and moving to Kansas. Today it rents commercial and storage space within the building. Off to our right there is Main Street in North Hartford. And we're coming up on the first switches for the Meadows Railyard. We can see the first lead lines off to our left there. Also, looming over to our left is the Meadows Drive-In Theater, which opened in 1955 and ran until its closure in 1975. Even up into the 70s, the area was still mostly undeveloped marshland, though today it's now a densely packed industrial area. Jennings Road cuts right through the center of where that lot used to be, and the concession stand and projection building were just next to the intersection of Jennings Road and Weston Road. That screen there would be directly where a gas station is now, just in front of the large post office distribution building. That theater could hold 2,500 cars in its lot. Also off in the distance, on the very left of the Hartford skyline there, we can see the outline of the Travelers Tower. That's the building on the left that looks like a bell tower. That was built in 1919, and that was the original headquarters for the Travelers Insurance Agency. Though now they're officially headquartered in New York City, that Hartford building is still the company's largest office. There we can see the tracks for the Hartford Meadows Yard. We're officially coming up on it now. The 5 tracks branching well off to our left there are long gone. They originally connected to the line that crossed over the river into East Hartford, where another large maintenance yard used to be. The tracks were used to hold and sort cars coming to or from the east. These could have been cars from Boston or from the Armory Branch line in Connecticut. Only about a third of the classification tracks in the yards still remain. The Meadows Music Arena, now called Xfinity Theater, is located at the south end of the yards, where tracks used to be. To our right is Windsor Street, running along next to the edge of the yards. In the 40s and 50s, this was a 4-track main line, with more industries on the right. Today it's only a double track, single in some spots, with very little industry around it. And back to our left, we see the tracks reforming to either join the east-west main lines, or to continue south to either service the downtown Hartford industries, or continue even further down the river to Middletown and beyond. We also see the small engine house and maintenance area. Across the river in East Hartford were major shops and a large roundhouse, but there was never anything major on this side, at least not during the 20th century. We'll give them a little toot on the whistle to say hello. And on our right there's Windsor Street diving down underneath the cross tracks as it heads downtown. These tracks coming up on our left are the main lines to the east. We're going to cross over them as we come around the corner into Union Station. Those tracks lead to what was known as the High, Dry, and Dusty. This line led to Boston and had originally been the main line between Boston and New York, until the New Haven Railroad acquired the shoreline route by buying out several railroads, and then that became the new main line. The High, Dry, and Dusty was never again as busy as it had been in the last few years of the 1800s. That name was given to the line because it didn't follow any rivers or coastlines, which was a rare practice during the early days of railroading. The line cut through the middle of Connecticut, mostly through unpopulated and remote areas. Boston to Hartford to Waterbury passenger service operated over the line until 1955, when hurricanes of that year caused massive flooding and washed out a bridge in Putnam, Connecticut. The bridge was never replaced, and that was the end of passenger service. Freight continued to operate over the single-track line, especially oversized freight cars that would not fit under the bridges and catenaries along the shore. We're now passing under Main Street and Albany Avenue in downtown Hartford. Here's the Walnut Street Bridge. There's the Y and small yards for the Griffin branch, which heads up to Bloomfield. That line had once connected to both Westfield, Massachusetts and Poughkeepsie, New York. By the 40s, the line only saw light passenger and local freight services. Bell on and a whistle for safety as we come into Hartford Union Station. This was built in 1889 and then rebuilt in 1914 after a fire gutted it. The station once joined the Hartford and New Haven, Central New England, Hartford and Connecticut Valley, and the New York and New England railroads. The New Haven would eventually acquire all these railroads through the 19th century, meaning that Hartford was in fact no longer a Union station at all, since it wasn't connecting any different railroads. However, the building was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1975 as the Hartford Union Station, so the Union is now officially part of the name. Crossing out the other side, we leave the platforms and pass over Asylum Street. And to the left is Bushnell Park and the Capitol Building. That Capitol Building was built over 6 years and opened in 1878. 10,000 Civil War veterans from all over Connecticut formed a long procession to the Capitol and deposited 30 regimental flags in the building. The dome originally had a 17-foot tall bronze statue, and during World War II, the piece was donated to the federal government to be melted down and used for ammunition and machinery. The same also happened to the original bucking horse statue on top of the dome at the Colt factory, which is also in Hartford. Additionally, in Bushnell Park is the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Arch, which is a large stone arch with turrets. That monument was built in 1886 to honor Hartford's Civil War veterans specifically. 4,000 residents of the city had gone off to war only 25 years earlier, and most of them were still alive and attended the ceremony in 1886. Now we're rounding this sharp corner. As we continue heading west, we've got 4 main tracks and then additional industry spurs off to our left. Just ahead of us is the Broad Street overpass, and on the far side of that, blowing the whistle now for the Flower Street crossing. We look behind us, we can see the buildings of downtown Hartford and our freight arching around the corner. As we cross Flower Street, dominating the skyline beyond it is the Aetna building. This was built in 1931 and is still the current headquarters of the Aetna Insurance Agency. This is the world's largest colonial revival building. The Aetna headquarters is crowned by its 86-foot-tall Georgian tower, inspired by the old State House downtown. Across the tracks from the building, on our left, used to be the Park River, which is now covered over and runs completely underneath Hartford. As of 1946, the river was still exposed here and ran next to the tracks and into Bushnell Park, where it went underground. Today, Park River goes underground where it crosses Farmington Avenue, a significant distance northwest of here, and another branch feeds it from the south and is called the South Brook, and that goes underground next to Route 84 near Park Street. The underground river empties into the Connecticut River from a tunnel just south of where the convention center now is. Passing under Sigany Street, Sigourney Street, by the way, is actually spelled Sigourney, but nobody says it that way. It's one of those weird colloquialisms. Everybody from Hartford adamantly insists that it is pronounced Sigourney. And hitting the speed signs for our 30-mile-an-hour zone. Here's a fun fact. At this time in 1947, Hartford was still the home of A1 steak sauce. A company called Hubline Incorporated began to import and distribute A1 steak sauce under license from an English company. They later got the rights to actually produce it here in Hartford, and I've heard there's times when the whole city just smelled like A1 steak sauce. Hubline Incorporated first started to sell the A1 steak sauce in 1906, and they continued until they were bought out in the 80s by Nabisco and then later Kraft Foods. And this little bridge coming up, this is the Capitol Avenue underpass. This is the same street that the state capitol building is on, and it heads from downtown into West Hartford. The next thing is going to be, we're crossing over the Park River. Oh, and here we have a northbound passenger train coming from the Newington and New Britain line. Crossing the speed markers for 50-mile-an-hour zone. This is the river that's now completely underground. We would actually, in real life, we would now be under the ramps for exit 46 off of Route 84. They go right over where the river used to be. Off to the left here, we have a small industrial clump on Park Street. This brick building here is Bishop Ladder and was built in 1931. We're coming up on the Park Street underpass now. We're going to go right over Park Street. Exactly 1 mile west, which is to our right, down the street in West Hartford, was the house that I lived in before I moved out of the state in 2017. And I lived there for about 10 years, and right down that road there, we followed it down. This is the Hamilton Street crossing that we're coming up on now. Over there on the left, that factory building with the angled skylights, that's the Hartford Empire Company. They were a factory for machines that made glass to be sold to other factories. That was built in 1940. And we're now going under where Interstate 84 now is, as it heads west out of Hartford. This empty space to our right is where the Bowtie Cinema Complex is located now, right next to the tracks. Coming up on the right, is Parkville Station. This was built in 1871 by the New York and New England Railroad, which was a competitor to the New Haven at the time. After bankruptcy, the New York and New England was acquired by New Haven in 1898. The station was used until 1959, when passenger service stopped. Just beyond Parkville is the Flatbush Avenue overpass, and that marks the town line of West Hartford. So we're now in West Hartford. In the distance, today, we would be able to see Colt's current location. They built a second factory here in West Hartford in 1960, and in 1994, moved out of the original armory building downtown and consolidated the business here in West Hartford. That spur branching off to the right would lead right to the Colt building. Here we're crossing Oakwood Avenue in West Hartford. That's still New Park Avenue over to our right, heading south. Next we cross over the Trout Brook, which is a small stream that flows through the center of West Hartford. Just to our left, it joins up with another stream to become the South Brook, which heads north to flow under Hartford and hooks up with the Park River to go underneath the city. We're coming alongside the Elmwood Station and New Britain Avenue, which we'll go over. Elmwood was another New York and New England station built in 1850. Passenger service continued until 1959. It's now in use again as a bus stop on the CT Fast Track busway, which is built on the right-of-way of the old tracks out to New Britain. It looks like the snow is starting to come back in again. I see the first few flakes coming down, and it looks like clouds are starting to move back in. So this could be a problem. You can see we're up to 37 miles per hour and gaining, but now we're starting to get some wheel slip already, so we're definitely, the tracks are slicking back up from the snow already. I've got the reverser at 40%. I'm going to try to get as much speed as I can before the tracks get so slippery that the wheels will be slipping. So we'll have a little bit extra speed to burn off if conditions deteriorate really bad. So now we're crossing into the town of Newington. We're leaving West Hartford into Newington. There's residential neighborhoods along Main Street and Day Street to our left. Here's Newington Station on Willard Avenue, which is the overpass beyond it. That's the Willard Avenue overpass. This was the final stop on the 1850 New York and New England line before it diverges off to head to New Britain. In 1891, the New Haven Railroad built its own station to our left to service its two Hartford tracks, which is not shown here. This was demolished after 1959 when passenger service stopped. The rest of the buildings still remain and have been refurbished and saved. This is the split at Newington Junction. The original New York and New England tracks to the right were known as the Highland Route and head west to New Britain, continuing west to Bristol, then looping south to arrive at Waterbury, which had a large freight yard and maintenance facilities. Waterbury was also the junction between the Highland and the Noggy, more officially known as the Naugatuck Route. The Noggy ran a single track north to the town of Winstead and double track south to Devon, where it joined the Shoreline main tracks just west of New Haven. This is an unnamed dirt road that we're crossing now, which is no longer there, and Piper Brook underneath us there. To our left, through these trees and over this hill, is the Veterans Home and Hospital, which was built in 1940 and is still operating today. It's one of the larger VA facilities in Connecticut. You can see the ceiling has socked back in. Can't see the stars now, and the snow is really picking back up. So I think we're definitely in phase 2 of tonight's Christmas Eve blizzard. "7:20 at night as we're nearing the Cedar Street overpass. And after that, we've got a long, lonely run through wilderness until we skirt along the edge of New Britain. We'll see it off to our right. It'll just be the very, very south end of New Britain. So operations update, I really haven't been talking about that too much, but maybe you've been seeing what I've been doing with the controls. We're at 100% throttle, we're at 36% reverser, which I'm maintaining until the wheels start slipping and I have to back off. Our boiler water is at 58%, which is good. We can basically run that down to 0 before the boiler explodes and ends the scenario. We don't want that to happen, so we're plenty good with that, and I'm pumping water in anyways. You can hear the steam and water injectors running, so that's good. And our fire mass is at 1,019 pounds, and so I'm going to let that drop down to around 975 and maintain that between 900 and 1,100, somewhere in that neighborhood. Our blower is off because we're moving, and the exhaust steam is providing its own draft through the boiler, and our dampers are wide open, so we're feeding the fire with as much air as we possibly can, coming in through the bottom of the locomotive, the bottom of the firebox. Now there, over there to the right, we can see that is one of the neighborhoods of New Britain, houses of New Britain. New Britain used to have the nickname the Hardware City because of its history as a manufacturing center and as the headquarters of Stanley Black & Decker. And here we are, green signal, crossing underneath Newington Avenue, which leads off to our right towards the downtown of the city of New Britain. Over to our right here is a dairy processing plant. This was built in 1930 on an extension of Belden Street that no longer exists. Today, it's Guida's Dairy Plant. And off to our left, here in 1947, is a whole lot of nothing. It's just more empty wilderness. But today, this would be a thick residential neighborhood coming off of Church Street. And back to the right is the last few houses of the south end of New Britain. more green signals for us, no problems there. And just coming into view around the bend is the South Street overpass. Alright, this big factory coming up here on the left, just before it is the Berlin town line. So we'll be leaving New Britain, we're heading into Berlin. I wasn't able to figure out what this factory was built for originally, but it may have been some sort of scrap processing facility based just on the fact that there is a waste disposal area on the other side of the road, and today there are recycling facilities where this building used to be. So if the zoning hasn't changed, maybe it's the same kind of industry that this building was at the time. And right around this area also we would be passing under Route 9 today as it heads southeast down towards Middletown. Alright, we've got a speed sign here, and we've got a 30-mile-an-hour zone ahead, so you can see I already had the blower on and closed the throttle. And we're going to apply the brakes. We'll just set 15 pounds on the brakes to begin a nice descent down to 30. Now this large complex on our left, this is the Berlin Construction Company. The building was built in 1902 with additional construction in 1940 and then again in 1962. The company fabricated steel for bridge and building structures and specialized in coal conveyors for power plants and still operates today. Now we're passing the Berlin Station. The stop was first opened in 1838, and the station we see here was built in 1900. Veering off to our left before the station are the tracks that once led to Middletown, built by the city of Middletown itself and taken over by the New Haven Railroad in 1850. Service to Middletown ended in 1932, and by the end of the 40s the track was already gone, as it is seen here. To the right is a small freight yard and a second Y that would lead us back up to New Britain to connect with the Highland route tracks downtown. We're paralleling Kensington Road on our right and looking into the Kensington section of the town. Here's the speed signs. We're back up to full speed once we exit the station area. Now we're passing under the road known as Camel's Back as we begin another long stretch through the middle of nowhere. We're staying with Kensington Road as it also heads south. Today there is plenty of civilization here with lots of neighborhoods, but in 1947 there was nothing but marsh and trees, with a few houses dotted here and there. Now the town of Berlin takes its name from the capital of Germany, or rather at the time it was named, it was the capital of Prussia, but the emphasis has always been on the first syllable instead of the second. The story goes that the pronunciation was changed during World War I to avoid seeming pro-German, but this is likely not true, and the Berlin pronunciation has always been that way. That's the more likely story, that it was just Americanized right from the beginning. Here's the Norton Road overpass. Now, Kensington Road, off to our right, has left us as we pass by Swede Pond on the right, and on the left is a small dirt road where the modern O'Connell Road and its neighborhood is. Coming up here on the Orchard Road crossing. This crossing can be considered Metacomet Drive, although it was unnamed at the time. This is the dirt road that the modern paved one is based off of, but at this time, it crossed the tracks to join up with Norton Lane. Now, Norton Lane is also this next crossing coming up around the curve here. Norton Lane was also, at the time, a dirt road, still only leading to a handful of houses like it does today. And we've got a man parked up on the hill on Norton Lane to train watch from the hill in the snow. Maybe one of the residents of one of those few houses up there. Silver Lake is to our left, with the Berlin Turnpike on the far shore, though at the time it was called the New Haven-Hartford Turnpike. Either way, it was still Route 5 and the only main road to travel north-south from New Haven to Springfield. If you're from this area, if you're from Connecticut or familiar with the area, imagine today having no other option than to drive Route 5 across the whole state with no highways. Pretty interesting to think about. And passing by the south end of the lake means that we've just crossed into Meriden, Connecticut. Those lights we see here, out to the right, are from street lamps and the one house at the end of Beaver Lake Road. The road no longer crosses the tracks, but in 1947 it did, and it led to a single house on the shore of Beaver Pond. Today there's a park and a baseball diamond there. And here we cross over Beaver Lake Road itself. This is the Hicks Avenue overpass. Today this road leads to a very large neighborhood off to our right, but at this time there was only 5 houses at the end of it. More green signals means that we're clear to keep highballing down through the middle of Meriden. And here we see the sign for Quarry Junction. Now today, most of this track is obscured by trees or completely built over by housing, but there used to be this large elevated Y for backing cars over the main line and into a large open-faced quarry on what used to be called Chauncey Peak. The quarry is still there, but the peak is not because they have mined so much stone out of it. This same spur also led to the Meriden site for Pratt and Whitney. They had a small satellite site located on Pratt Street. Fitting, right? In the other direction, the spur leads to the Russell Hall Paper Company, which still operates from the same spot out of Meriden since 1923. And there above us is the railroad tracks from that spur crossing over. And we're getting into the north end of Meriden here. The first houses, that's Gracie Avenue out to our right. And there we can see we're getting into we're heading towards downtown Meriden as we approach the distinctive double crossing of Colony and Britannia Streets. To the left of the intersection is the Independent Thread Company, a textile mill built in 1901. That's just off there to our left. On the left is the medium-sized Meriden Yards. It had several tracks for loading and unloading general goods into the city, and some spurs to directly service a few industries nearby. And at the south end of the yards, just past these signals, we would be passing under Interstate 691 before that overpass. So right in this area, this is where 691 is coming into the city. This overpass that we do see, this is Camp Street going over the tracks. And you probably noticed we passed the speed sign. This is a very low speed area, passing through the center of town and by the Meriden station, so I'm braking down to 20 miles an hour. Blower is on. We'll use this opportunity to pump some more water into the boiler while the demand for steam is low. And maybe we'll put some more coal in there too. This is the Brook Street crossing. And you can see it's also the beginning of the platform for the Meriden station. It's just beyond the crossing. So, bell on for safety. And we'll whistle for the crossing and to let anyone on the platform know that we're coming. And this is Meriden Station. This was first opened in 1838. The first station on the spot was a 2-story building, gabled, blue with gold trim. After 100 years, the New Haven Railroad built this brick colonial-style station that we see here in 1942. This station only lasted about 30 years, as the town tore it down in 1970 and put in a 1-story square shit heap in its place. It looked atrocious. Thankfully, that was torn down in 2016, and a brand new, multi-level station has now been built in its place. And now we have another double crossing on the south end of the platform. These are the East Main Street and Perkins Street crossings. So just to our left, about a mile up East Main Street here, up the long hill, is Swain Avenue, which is where my mother grew up in the 50s and 60s. I have lots of memories of visiting that house as a kid when we went down to see my grandparents. To our right is the Merriam Foster Company. They built small appliances and fabricated metal. This is the Cherry Street crossing. And now we're crossing Cooper Street. There was a small gun manufacturer off to our right for a time. Built in the early 1900s, it's no longer there. And we can see our caboose just crossing over East Main Street. As we finally clear the level crossing here in downtown Meriden. And now all this traffic finally gets to go after waiting all this time. Okay, this underpass here, this is South Colony Street, and it dips down underneath us, crossing over to our right. I'm up to 1,300 pounds, or nearly 1,300 pounds of coal, so I've closed the firebox. We're going to let that start to burn back down. As we head out of town, we'll be coming back up to speed here. We're still in a 20-mile-an-hour zone at the moment, but once we're clear, I'm going to try to bring us back up to speed. As we creep around the corner here, we're blowing the whistle for the Fall Avenue crossing. Still in Meriden at this point. And we're clear of the 20-mile-an-hour zone, so throttle is back to full, reverser at 35%. We're going to start to speed back up to our 30 to 40 mile an hour speed that we were doing before. This is the Gypsy Lane crossing. And we have another northbound passenger train passing us up here on the left, on its way from New Haven up to Springfield, with a stop at Hartford. Oop, and there's our wheel slip. Trying to get a few extra miles per hour out of our speed. And as we see the houses on the right, and Old Colony Road is getting closer, we cross over the town line into Wallingford, Connecticut. Next to this factory up ahead is the small Yalesville freight station. Yalesville is the northern section of Wallingford and was named for Charles Yale after he bought the local mill and surrounding lands. And there's that little freight station. Old Colony Road dropping away off to our right. This is the South Broad Street underpass, which is Route 150. Up ahead, out there in the distance, we see a large elevated highway. That's the Wilbur Cross Parkway, which is Route 15. This was named for the governor who was in office when construction began in 1939. The Wilbur Cross Parkway was built over about 10 years. World War II delayed it significantly, but the section we're going under was opened in 1946. The final section was in New Haven, and the entire 4-lane parkway was completed in 1949. The parkway was a toll road until 1988. And now here we are at the Buell Street crossing, followed immediately by the Church Street crossing. And to the left is North Colony Road, which is Route 5 still. This is the Pent Highway crossing. This factory up here on our left is the Follansbee Steel Corporation, built in 1953. This is the North Plains Highway crossing. And we're starting to get into the thicker, more populated downtown area of Wallingford. In fact, here's a view looking over Route 5 towards the center of Wallingford, with a heavy industrial area on the right. Crossing Hartford Street. And then immediately we're at the Parker Street crossing. We're now essentially in the center of the city. There on our right, paralleling us now, is North Cherry Street. And we have a small freight yards before the station for some light industry and commercial goods. Just south of the yards is the Wallingford Passenger Station and the two crossings on either side of it, which are Hall Avenue and Quinnipiac Street. The station was built in 1871 by the New Haven Railroad in the style known as French Second Empire, which is similar to the Windsor station. The building is still in place. It was closed to the public in 1994, and it's now used for adult education and is also the home of the New Haven Model Railroad Club. On the right, we see this large white building with the corner right near the tracks. This is the H.L. Judd Company. When this building was built in 1875, the Judd Manufacturing Company had already been in business for 45 years making drapery, window, and picture hardware. In 1954, Stanley Works of New Britain, which is now Stanley Black & Decker, bought out H.L. Judd. Stanley Judd drapery products were popular through the 1970s, but the factory shut down in the 80s. Today, the building has been redeveloped into condos. Now we're going to see we've got this siding over to our right, but there's a spur coming in from the right, and that leads to the Allegheny Steel Company, which is still in operation since 1935, and the R. Wallace & Sons Manufacturing Company, a huge manufacturer of silver utensils. Robert Wallace began making silverware from German silver in the 1830s. By 1860, his small shop employed 37 people and turned out some 700,000 forks and spoons made of German silver. In 1865, the plant here in Wallingford was built. During World War I, Wallace & Sons supplied 16 million tin-plated cast steel knives, forks, and spoons for the U.S. Army. They are still in operation today, though they moved to a new building in 1978. That was the John Street crossing that we just went by, and this is Route 5, just right off of our left, paralleling us. Right there, almost matching our speed, that is the vehicle that will kill this railroad and several others. Truck. Oops. Well, here's the spur looking back on our right here. That is American Cyanamid. That complex was built in the 1940s, and the company produced rubbers and chemicals. Today, the plant is occupied by Allnex, which produces resins and coatings. This is the Tolls Road crossing. Only the little scooters seem to have their headlights on. Just right here, we're passing over the Allen Brook, which marks the town boundary between Wallingford and North Haven, Connecticut. So, we have now entered North Haven, Connecticut. We're almost to our destination of New Haven. We're getting very close now. Ahead of us here, this is the Noom Road crossing, which today the crossing is a little farther back, slightly behind us, and is called Defco Park Road. Now, coming up here on the right, see these lights, this enormous facility. This was the North Haven plant for Pratt & Whitney. Now, this site has a special connection to me because this is where my grandfather worked as an aeronautical engineer. He was on the team in 1970 that designed the F-100 jet engine to be used in the F-15 Eagle and F-16 Fighting Falcon, and it was done here at this facility. The building was built in 1952, and it is still the largest industrial development site in southern Connecticut. It had 2 water towers with a total capacity of 2.2 million gallons. 500 draftsmen and engineers worked on jet engine designs and manufacturing at the plant. The plant operated 24 hours a day with around 8,100 employees in 1969, making engine blades, fuel tube linings, motors, and more. The plant maintained 2 cafeterias, police and fire departments, a bank, credit union, a doctor, and around-the-clock nurses. The plant became such a large operation that the company had to add space to the plant and buy neighboring houses to build additional parking. Pratt & Whitney closed the North Haven plant in 2002. Amazon has now bought the land and has built a huge distribution center there. And that crossing was the entranceway to the plant, coming from Route 5 and circling around to the parking lots around Pratt & Whitney. This is the Farrow Lane crossing. This road is no longer there, but there is a dirt and gravel crossing located behind the parking lot that's now there. This is a crossing with an unnamed road. The road is not there anymore, there's no evidence of it, but this is located directly behind the Stop and Shop on Route 5 in North Haven. Just after that crossing, we would now be passing under the elevated Clintonville Road, which in 1947 we don't see because it didn't come this far out, and Interstate 91 on its way south to New Haven. Blower is on, and I have shut the throttle as we are beginning to apply some brakes and slow down, because I can see the signals up ahead for our junction to get to the Cedar Hill yards. We're crossing under Broadway now, as we put the bell on for safety as we roll through the North Haven station. This station was opened in 1838 by the New Haven Railroad. In 1967, a small brick station was built. The station and stop were discontinued by the New Haven in the 60s. Both the station and a wooden freight house are still on the site, though Amtrak uses a different location now for stops in North Haven. This is the Quinnipiac River we're crossing over. Finally, we have reached the split for Cedar Hill yards. The main lines to the right continue south but bypass the humongous yard complex. They head down right to the platforms at the sprawling New Haven station. Now we've made our crossover. Here we are entering the Cedar Hill yards. We have another large freight waiting for us to clear out of the way so they can head north. Looks like a big trailer on flat car manifest. Transporting trailers was pretty big business for the New Haven. They were often considered hot freights. And they usually were the most time imperative cargoes to be delivered. And looking back out behind us, we can see our own train stretching well around the curve. With no trees here, no leaves, we can see right out to the end where the caboose is, just passing the front of that other freight train. We're crossing back over the Quinnipiac River again. Quinnipiac is an Algonquin phrase for long water land, which is what they named the river and the area near its mouth where it flows out into Long Island Sound. The river is 45 miles long, starting in a swamp west of New Britain and flowing to New Haven where it enters the sea. The river feeds the Quinnipiac River Marsh, which separates the Cedar Hill yards from the passenger mains on the west bank. The entire area is a massive marshland, and the railroad tracks flow around various swamp areas and small ponds, and that's this constant watery area to our right that we're going to see all the way down this whole marshland fed by the Quinnipiac River. Immediately to our left right now would be Interstate 91, and this crossing is the Sackett Point Road crossing, and this road cuts right across the marshes to rejoin with Route 5 on the west side. So we're now arriving at the Cedar Hill yards. These yards were mostly located in North Haven, although they are often referred to as the New Haven yards. Cedar Hill was the largest rail yard on the East Coast for a time. It was built between 1910 and 1920. The roundhouses were built in 1911. The Shoreline Receiving Yard, New York Maybrook Receiving Yard, the two humps, Eastbound Classification Yard, and Westbound Classification Yard were built in 1918. Because the city of New Haven was at a central crossroads in the railroad, the yards are divided into several sections to handle the incoming and outgoing traffic from many directions. I'll point them out as we go by them to make it easier to visualize. To our left, we see some coal conveyors, and on the far side of them is a large material storage yard. Also going through that same area are the tracks leading to what was called the Air Line. This was the line that went from New Haven to Willimantic. Along the way, they passed through Middletown and could transfer to the Valley Line at that point. The tracks off to our right go to what appears to be a sawmill for turning tree trunks into railroad ties. This was the Montouise tie plant, built in 1922. Here, the New Haven Railroad cut its own ties and coated them with creosote to preserve them. Creosote is a dark brown oil distilled from coal tar and is used as a wood preservative. Tie preservation was a new idea around the turn of the century. Prior to then, railroad ties were just laid down without any coatings and would rot away fairly quickly. In 1921, the New Haven Railroad was replacing an average of 372 untreated ties per mile. If you just look at the distance we've run tonight, around 60 miles, that's over 22,000 ties that would have to be replaced in 1 year. And the New Haven had several hundred miles of track. That same year, the New York Central, who had begun preserving their ties several years before, only reported an average of 172 ties per mile, or more than half the amount of the New Haven. Additionally, the Santa Fe Railroad reported that preserving its ties was saving them $700,000 in annual track maintenance, which, with inflation, would be $9.8 million in today's money. The New Haven took notice of these savings and built their tie plant in 1922 to cut and creosote locally harvest trees into ties themselves. We're down to yard speed of 15 miles an hour, and we have a long way to go. It's quite a long lead-in coming into the yard. So it takes a few minutes to get in, but we can see we're right up close to the Montouise tie plant over to our right. To our left is the north and eastbound classification yards. It has 41 tracks. Here freight cars would be sorted based on their destinations. Anything heading up the Springfield branch to Middletown or to Boston would be sorted here. My mother and her friends would come to this area on the night shift and watch them assembling trains in the 1970s. On the far side of the northbound yard are several repair tracks and facility buildings. Looking out to our right, across the Quinnipiac River and the marshes, we can just barely see signs of civilization on the far side. Again, that's where the passenger mains are, and several roads and neighborhoods. And our own train stretching behind us back into the darkness. Turning off the water injectors now. We're at 88% boiler water level, and we're not going to be using too much more, so we can secure filling both water and coal at this point. Okay, now to our left are the transfer platforms. Boxcars and reefers are parked there if cargo inside needed to be individually moved between the cars. This area has 27 tracks. Behind the transfer platforms on the far side is the shoreline departure area. Trains are assembled here that will be following the shoreline tracks to Boston. There are 9 tracks. Even farther behind the shoreline departure area is the New York and Maybrook receiving area. Maybrook was the most western New Haven Railroad yard and was located in upstate New York. Here, freight would transfer to and from other railroads and was seen as the gateway to New England. Heavy freights, pulled by 210-2 Santa Fe locomotives, would come in and out of Maybrook. It was the only truly mountainous section of the entire railroad. The route also crossed the impressive Poughkeepsie Bridge. Maybrook freights, or those from New York City, would pull into the receiving area to then be sorted to go out again. This area had 7 tracks. On the outside of the Maybrook area was the departure tracks for the airline to Middletown or Willimantic. Now, here we are, finally arriving at our destination after almost 2 hours of being constantly underway. Heavy freight coming down from Springfield. We are considered to be westbound, so we're being routed into the yards ahead, which are the westbound classification yards. This has 37 tracks, with 7 repair tracks off to our left. Also to the left of our inbound yard is the shoreline receiving tracks. This is for freight coming in from the shoreline from anywhere between here and Boston. There are 6 tracks. And brakes are on. We're just going to let them come up. We'll stop at around 30 pounds on the brakes. 5 miles an hour. And finally, we grind to a stop here on track 32 of the westbound receiving yards in Cedar Hill. Our responsibility to this freight has ended, though we're not quite done for the night just yet. We're going to decouple from this train and then head over to the water tower to fill up before we park and turn over the engine to another crew. Releasing the train brakes. And crack the throttle. We're going to proceed forward out of the classification yards, and then we're going to cross over a little bridge across the Quinnipiac River yet again, and then we'll actually go through the Maybrook outbound yards. We'll cut through those, and then we'll end up over at the turntables and maintenance area. Here we go, crossing the Quinnipiac for the last time. Right in the middle of the river is going to be the city line for New Haven. We're now coming into the New York and Maybrook departure yards, and we're under electrification catenaries for the first time. This area had 13 tracks. This area would have been for freight trains bound for points west, like New York City, or through the mountains to Maybrook yards in upstate New York. The corridor from New Haven to New York had been electrified since 1914, when the railroad was the first in the country to use high voltage, alternating current in overhead catenaries. While this is commonplace today, New Haven's system was unprecedented at the time. To our left, we can just start to see the two large roundhouses. These were both built in 1911. One is an open circle with 22 bays, and the other is a complete circle with 32 bays. To our right, beyond the Maybrook yard section, the passenger main line is hooking back up with us. We've just crossed milepost 03. The double track runs along the outside of the Maybrook yards and continues down to the New Haven station, 3 miles to our south. As we're coming in and getting a nice close look at these roundhouses here, we're cutting through the maintenance and diesel refueling tracks. Also in this area would have been the platforms for inspecting pantographs, although that is not recreated here in the game. FA1s, GP9s, and RS3s all sitting in the yard waiting for their next assignment. To our right, beyond the yards and main line, we can see the neighborhoods alongside State Street, which is Route 5. Basically, we followed that road all the way along our whole journey tonight. We began by going under the Route 5 bridge in the south end of Springfield, and it's been alongside us the whole way as it now goes towards downtown New Haven, where it will finally end just a few blocks from the passenger station. Looming ahead of us now, coming out of the dark, is the distinctive New Haven Coal Tower. This was built in 1927 by the Roberts and Schaefer Company. The tower holds 2,400 tons of coal. The tower had an additional conveyor belt, which is not shown here, that would have refilled it constantly from underground bunkers. Roberts and Schaefer is an engineering firm from Chicago that was founded in 1903 and still operates today. At the time, they specialized in reinforced concrete buildings and mining and railroad coaling equipment. The tower is unusual in its design, looking like a big fat spider perched on its many legs. The tower is still in the New Haven yards today, although no tracks run under it. The tower is on the National Registry of Historic Places. It's protected by that, so it can't be demolished, but there are no plans to restore the tower either, so it just sits, abandoned. Near the coal tower, we see an L-class and an I-class locomotive. The L-class were 210-2 Santa Fe's. New Haven had 50 of these locomotives. All Santa Fe types across all U.S. railroads had severe counterbalancing problems with their driving wheels, and this limited their speed to 25 miles an hour. However, these locomotives lasted on the New Haven Railroad until well after World War II because of their massive pulling power through the mountains of the Maybrook route. They were all built by Alco in Schenectady in 1918. L-classes had 63-inch driving wheels. They were retired in 1948, being replaced by the brand new Alco FAs. The I-class was a fast 462 passenger locomotive. New Haven had 138 of these locomotives. I-classes were built between 1907 and 1916 by a mix of companies. The early variants had 73-inch driving wheels, while the later I-3 and I-4s had 79-inch drivers. The streamlined Hudson class of 1937 were called I-5s, however, they were actually 464s, so not technically part of the rest of the I-class. And there's our water tower we'll be backing into in a moment, once we clear all these switches. And we ease in right under the water tower. Now, as we back into the water tower to top off our tender, let's look at how much fuel we've burned getting down here. We began this trip with 12,000 gallons, and now we're at 4969. That's 7,031 gallons over 58 miles. We also started off with 39,200 pounds of coal, and now we're at 33,433. So we've burned 5,667 pounds. So average fuel consumption for this locomotive on this trip tonight, for every mile that we traveled, we burned 121 gallons of water and 99 pounds of coal. As we can see, this locomotive could go for another 300 miles with the coal we still have on board, but we used most of our water, and so that's the limiting factor for steam locomotives. Some railroads, like the London and Northwestern Railway in Britain, or even the New York Central, installed troughs of water between the rails so a passing locomotive could scoop up water without stopping. Another limiting factor is lubrication, as steam locomotives had to have various parts inspected and re-greased every 100 to 130 miles, generally. So, as much as many of us love steam locomotives, they were really a maintenance nightmare for the railroads to maintain. And the efficiency and ease of operation of diesels really becomes apparent when you look at the man-hours needed to service a fleet of steam locomotives. And that's it. Here we are. We are finally at the end of the line. Just had to top off the water. We're going to jump down from our R-class and head indoors to grab some coffee and maybe shoot the shit while we turn this locomotive over to the next crew. We just had to top it off. You always want to turn over equipment in good working order and not throw your watch relief under the bus, because that's just a dick move. Thank you once again for coming along the trip with me. Hope you enjoyed this snowy night trip through the state of Connecticut in 1947. Hopefully we'll see you back here in the future for more trips along the virtual New Haven Railroad. We'll see you then.